Just as a quick follow-up from a lot of the themes that we've been hearing about, it was an earlier conversation that we had with Holden, who mentioned that they're moving into Wari, a secondary city, but still well established and developed, which is ripe for development. Another comment that was made in one of the earlier panel discussions was managing to tap into those low-hanging fruits. Secondary cities. Opening remarks from each of you. Is it justified, the investment that you can make into these particular regions? Are financial markets also open to investing in them? And more importantly, how difficult is it to convince a tenant to follow you through this particular development? Fred, let's get your views on secondary cities.
Thank you very much. In terms of economic making, the fact that what we are doing makes economic sense, this is actually a case, especially in Tanzania, where you have a dramatic growth in terms of demographic factors. In recent years, there has been a massive movement of people, rural-urban migration. And again, we have other factors which are driving the growth. We have education, expansion in universities. We have oil and gas, agriculture, and in some instances, even the policies which are advanced by the government have indicated or have put to a case where some of the new development are happening because of the government need to address some of the cities which are growing at a rate where services such as water, electricity cannot accommodate all the people, and therefore the need for expanding into smaller towns which are away from the capital cities. Mm-hmm. But in all cases, the growth has been supported by even the financial market, which is supportive in terms of advancing the needed capital to develop new developments. And there has been expansion in demand for residential development, particularly in areas beyond Dar es Salaam for our case. And we see that in future or in the very few coming years, this expansion will continue, and economically it is justifiable to do what you are doing.
Economically justifiable. Graham, your view?
I think so. Just to say, Carlisle works very closely with ABLAND. In fact, in joint venture in East Africa, and our major focus is on secondary towns. So one of our favorite secondary towns is Dar es Salaam.
I see that swipe there. I'm not too sure how you're going to respond to it in a moment, Fred.
But there are a whole host of reasons for that optimism. Certainly Kenya, which I know best. I don't really know Tanzania that well, and Uganda, where we are working in Kampala. But I think things like the rapid rate of urbanization, and while Nairobi does play in relation to Kenya the same sort of role that London plays in relation to England, it's very much sucks the energy into it. With devolution, with resources from the national budget going into the counties, we're seeing huge amounts of additional growth and infrastructure investment happening in the counties and in the cities that anchor those counties. So, and they've prosperous, fast-growing cities, many of them, and have been largely, from a development point of view, ignored, both by local Kenyan investors, but also by international investors. I think what drives it too is demand. Retailers now want to get into those towns. They want to be in decent environments because the main streets are congested, very difficult for shoppers to get there to find parking. So there are a whole host of reasons that make them really interesting cities. But they're difficult to understand because the data's no good. If you look at the census, I mean, if you look at the census figures for Uganda, you wouldn't put any money there because nobody could afford anything. But actually, the Kenyan economy is so rooted in small, medium enterprises that are employing large numbers of people, that are growing rapidly. And then I think another factor that we never talk about here is the diaspora. There are 3 million Kenyans living in the US. The remittances to Kenya form about 3%, I'm told, of GDP of Kenya, and I presume it's the same in Tanzania.
Almost.
Yeah, and in Uganda. And the nature of that spending It supports consumption, but it's also driving a whole lot of investment into those towns. And so I think there are a whole set of factors when you look at them. We talk about the growing middle class, and people say, is the middle class growing? Isn't the middle class growing? But actually you see it. And so in the second, Nairobi's a sort of a mall culture. It's about entertainment. It's about going, hanging out in the coffee shops. The middle classes in the smaller towns are also looking for that. So there are huge opportunities, and again, tenants in that kind of business, the business of food and beverage, hospitality, are looking for decent places to do it. So I think there are huge opportunities in the towns that have been ignored.
That's the east of the continent. But Stephen, you can walk us through Zambia and some of the unique nuances that we're seeing there, which is traditionally what? A copper mining country?
Yes. So our view is that first to market wins the day. If you go into these secondary towns and you put up a mall with the right anchors and you bring in all the national tenants, you will dominate that town for the long term. There's certain provisos. You know, we like to believe that you need land for expansion, because you might expand in 5 or 10 years' time or whatever it is. But if you've got that dominant mall, as the market grows and as the tenants want to come into that mall, you will be that number one mall in that town for the long term. You know, the secondary towns, we also find that the people know a lot of the retailers. They're aspirational, and you end up saving them a lot of travel time where they do have to travel to that major city to go and shop. But if you can bring them those retailers, and the retailers do want to be there, there's a massive social benefit to those communities as well. Some of the negatives are that in these secondary towns, sometimes the services aren't as one would expect in a first sort of the major city, and so sometimes your capital costs of just getting the infrastructure up to speed in terms of getting power to your site, or sewer or water connections or whatever it is, can be costly. So your initial yield might not be as good, but if you're taking a long-term view and you can move at speed and you can move in quickly, and you've got the right mix, we believe that's the way to go over the long term.
As you can tell, Christia, you probably share the same sentiments as your colleagues here on the panel, but as Stephen highlights, risks, there are pros and cons, and negative perceptions sometimes when it comes to investing in these outlying cities, but the opportunities abound. I'm sure when you interact with several of your clients, you need to take in all those additional factors that Stephen did list, as well as in the presentation we heard from Jess earlier on today about the distribution centers, making sure that you have increased electricity supply. And you see this because you also operate in markets like Zambia and Ghana.
Yes, I mean, we're more focused on our larger metropolitan areas. We feel that where there are larger concentrations of people, you have a larger customer base. So that sometimes justifies our grade A buildings, and perhaps bigger buildings. And that happens over time. If you look at Manda Hill in 1999, it was a 19,000 square meter mall, more strip mall. It's now 43,000 square meters, and it's a busy mall. It's now a dominant mall in that area, that and Accra Mall too. They're our best performing assets. So we like our capital cities. But that said, once you're in your capital city and you're on the ground, you're able to unlock your opportunities, you're more aware of them. So now we have moved into, we're going to be building in Kumasi, that's a secondary city in Ghana. Our approach for secondary cities has been to start a little bit smaller. Kumasi's got about a 2.5 million population, and during the day it booms to about 3 million as people come in and out. And we felt that whilst theoretically Kumasi could probably handle about 40,000 square meters, we're going to start off with about 18,000. But we're going to landlock, and we're going to do exactly what Stephen says he does. We're going to just do phase 2 and perhaps phase 3 and so forth, and grow it with the people over time.
When you say starting from a low base, does that automatically mean lower yields, lower spend from those consumers who will be visiting these retail centers? Rental income? So is that a conscious decision that developers need to actually make?
Yeah, if I can answer that.
Stephen, go ahead.
Your land cost is effectively, for phase 2 and 3, all put into your costs up front. into your capital costs up front, so it does reduce your yield initially. And you're not generating any income on that land. But if you've got a long-term view, the minute you start building phase 2 or phase 3, then your yield will shoot up because your land cost was already covered in phase 1.
And that also goes back to that story about tenants, right, where you mentioned that you need to ensure that you have powerful tenants who will basically aid you in your developments going through into these particular regions. On the tenants, though, do you need unique nuances? Because a first-class city to someone else might be a second-grade city to another, like we heard earlier on.
See, I think Kenya, sorry to cut you off, I think Kenya's and East Africa lucky because there are a large number of local, strong local retailers, the equivalent of nationals here, who want to get, who probably are in the secondary towns already, but are looking for better premises. So I think that's the strength of East Africa, which I guess is different, maybe not in Zambia, but certainly in West Africa. So you can safely bank on, if you're doing a large mall in Nairobi, 35,000 square meters of tenants who are good tenants, not just moms and pops that you're going to have to find. And most of those people are looking to move out, or as I said, are already in the secondary towns, but are looking for decent and proper premises to operate from. And that makes it quite different. So it means that your rentals, you can get decent rentals that warrant the investment from them. And those tenants are often East African wide.